Thanks so much for watching our video updates on the book of John. It's been encouraging just to hear the feedback from you guys on what you're learning. Please continue to send us comments either here on the YouTube page or email us any of your thoughts. It's definitely good to hear what you guys are learning, and hopefully you're also sharing those things with each other. Today we're going to jump into John chapter 5. And it's encouraging. The chapter starts off here with a story about a man who was invalid, paralyzed for 38 years. And the theme I walked away with from this chapter, especially the beginning of the chapter, is: are you making an effort or are you making excuses? Because Jesus comes to this man and he asks him a critical question. There in verse 6, he says, do you want to get well? Do you want to get well? It's a great question, I think, for us to ask ourselves at all times. The things we're struggling with, do we really want to change them? And so we see here with the invalid, what does he do? Well, he makes excuses. He says, sir, I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. When I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me. You know, right now we can find ourselves in this same position, faced with making many excuses. Excuses as to why we can't share our faith, excuses as to why we can't grow spiritually because we're in the midst of this time of quarantine. And I really want to encourage you, man, let's not be like the invalid, putting ourselves in this position of making excuses, but let's keep pushing for our spiritual growth and really strive to make an effort to grow in our walk with God at this time. You know, we see what's happening with the invalid, but then we see this contrast in what's happening with Jesus. That where the invalid is making excuses, man, we see Jesus is still making an effort. And he makes the effort by healing this man, but he begins to get questions as to why he's healing on the Sabbath. And so he responds back to the Jewish leaders in verse 17. It says, in his defense, Jesus said to them, my Father is always at his work, and to this very day I too am working. Jesus, again in verse 19 says, very truly I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can only do what he sees the Father doing, because what the Father does, the Son also does. You know, this is encouraging. Again, to see this contrast between the paralyzed man and Jesus. Again, where are you at this time? Are you just making excuses? Excuses as to, again, why you're not growing spiritually, why you're not able to help others grow spiritually? Or are you like Jesus? Are you at work at all times? And even more so, are you allowing the Father to work through you? Jesus says, hey, I'm only doing what the Father has called me to do. He's the one that's working through me. And I really encourage you, man, maybe you feel like you can't do much right now. That's okay. God can do a lot through you. If you allow God to work through you, man, he can do amazing things. You know, the rest of the chapter goes on. And if I'm honest, man, it's a little hard to follow as you read through the rest of the chapter. And sometimes we can just kind of read through and not really take anything away. But I want to give you a couple nuggets that I pulled out and would really enjoy hearing what you learned as well. Jesus speaks a little bit of his authority as the Son of God, as well as his authority to give judgment. And man, that's sometimes something maybe when we want to shy away from. But he speaks of his authority to give judgment. And in verse 25, this is what stood out to me. It says, "Very truly I tell you, a time is coming and has now come when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live." Now the time has come. Now the time has come for people to hear the gospel. Do you believe that this is still true today? Jesus said this certainly for his time, that the time for people to go from dead to life was then. And brothers and sisters, I believe it's still happening now. Yesterday we read John chapter 4 and talked about, hey, opening our eyes to see the harvest. Brothers and sisters, the harvest is there. Now is the time for the dead to find life in Jesus. Are we sharing our faith and allowing that to come true? The rest of the chapter closes with some testimony about Jesus. We see John's testimony about him. Jesus testifies about himself. And hopefully it reminded you of your own testimony, your own relationship with God. But I love what Jesus says. He's like, actually, I have one even greater, an even higher testimony than I could give about myself. And that is God's testimony about him. In verse 26, he says, "I have a weightier testimony than that of John. For the works that the Father has given me to finish, the very works that I am doing, testify that the Father has sent me. And the Father who sent me has himself testified concerning me." That is so encouraging that God himself is testifying about Jesus. And I couldn't help but think, man, if I'm a son of God as well, what is God's testimony about me? Again, sometimes I feel like I can shortchange my own testimony. I can feel like, man, my testimony's not that powerful. But what would God say my testimony is? What are his words about me that are even greater than what I would say about myself? Finally, the chapter ends with this super challenging verse that really gave me a lot to chew on. In verse 44, it says, "How can you believe since you accept glory from one another, but do not seek the glory that comes from God?" Wow. No matter what your testimony is about yourself, we can't be given over to accepting glory from one another. We've got to seek glory that comes from God. Where are you seeking your glory these days? Who is it that you're turning to for approval in your life? Hopefully, I definitely hope you're sharing your testimony with others, but are you doing it to gain glory from them? Or are you doing it to give glory to God and see God's glory shown in your own life? Brothers and sisters, I hope this has been encouraging to your walk with God. We love you much and hope to see you again very soon.